Let's try this again. Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 4 in Lit 215. I did actually just record this whole video and then it got lost in cyberspace, so we're going to try this again. So this week we're starting Asian American literature and our next book, Little Fires Everywhere. So I'm going to try and keep this video just a few minutes because there's another one I'd like you to watch for this week. So let's go ahead and get started. So assignments you've got this week include reading quiz 4, discussion board 4, and to just look over the proposal assignment we've got due in week 5. So this next assignment, I want you to think about what particular type of multicultural literature, subject, or topic that you would like to pursue in your project. If you need to go back and look at the project description, I encourage you to do so. And I will post this week a couple examples of projects just to kind of get your brain moving. I wanted to encourage all of you also to start the discussion board early. I do try and remind you of the due date when Thursday hits, but I can definitely tell some of us might be waiting until the last minute, and that definitely makes it more difficult to keep the conversation authentic. So post early, reply early, and make sure that you're also reading my replies back to you. Alrighty, so we are starting Little Fires Everywhere, which is a novel of Asian American literature by a woman named Celeste Ng. So I wanted to talk first before we, jump into this type of literature, that we take a step back and think about what we really mean when we say Asian American. So this is the fastest growing racial group in the US as of the 2010 census. Traditionally and historically, Asian American was defined as those who are of Asian ancestry, naturalized citizens in the US. However, as you can see from this image to the right, if we think about Asia, it includes a large area, incredibly large, much larger than the US. So really, we've now started to think of Asian American as excluding West Asia, which would be Middle Eastern, and then Central Asia. The largest groups of Asian Americans in the US are Chinese, Indian, and Filipino. And I don't know if that is surprising to any of you all, but I think it definitely does bring home the idea that these are, very different experiences of very large, diverse groups of people. So some things that have affected Asian American literature that I wanted to kind of touch on was immigration trends from Asia. So we've had people from Asia immigrating to the US since the 17th century, but this didn't increase from all Asian countries until the mid-1900s, like about the 1960s. And there are reasons for that. So we did definitely have large groups of immigrants from China and Japan in the early 1900s, which you may have studied in school. But part of that immigration was not viewed positively by those in power in the US because they viewed these immigrants, specifically those from Japan, as being unable to adapt to American culture. And by that, I think really they meant just unable to act white, unable to kind of uphold these societal standards. Essentially, people in power during the early 1900s really wanted the US to look a certain way. They wanted Americans to act a certain way. They wanted them to have a very distinct culture. And this influenced immigration laws. So if you're not aware of eugenics, it's the study of genetics with a focus on homogeny. So it's the idea that there is an ideal genetic pool and that there are ways to ensure the genetic purity of a race. So this was also a large influence in the treatment of Jews during the Holocaust. So that kind of gives you an idea of where, this approach starts. But anyway, so there were some nativist immigration laws established in the early 1900s that sought to establish a distinct American identity by preserving its ethnic homogeneity, which essentially means people in power decided that those who were not white should be ranked by desirability, and that we wanted this certain type of immigrant, but not this one. And you can imagine that really has influenced a lot of how Asian Americans are viewed, where they live, when and in what ways they immigrated to the US and how their families have grown here. So I found this quote by a historian that I liked explaining this sort of immigration focus on excluding Asians. And she says at one level, the new immigration law differentiated Europeans according to nationality and ranked them in a hierarchy of desirability. At another level, the law constructed a white American race in which persons of European descent shared a common whiteness, distinct from those deemed to be not white. So I think this makes a good point about how it was not just about excluding those who don't look white, but deciding of those who do look white, who we would more want to be here. And this is just something that obviously is going to influence not only those who move here, but also what they write about. So Asian American literature is fairly new as a literary category in the US. Like I said, Asian immigration boomed after the 60s, so it makes sense that in the 1970s, this literature would start to grow in popularity. We do kind of loosely define this literature as Asian American stories written by Asian American authors. And there's a couple things that are a little problematic about this definition, like how do we define Asian American? If an Asian American writes a story about non-Asian Americans, is it still their literature? And these questions are ones that we've also kind of talked about in Native American literature, and that really is sort of the focus of just multicultural studies in general. But we can identify some common themes: race, culture, and identity. Particularly in Asian American literature, at least the literature that I've been exposed to, does talk about gender, sexuality, and age more. I think these themes come up more in Asian American literature than maybe some other categories. But we'll also see this sort of yin and yang between traditional and non-traditional, between Asian culture and the Western culture that immigrants would be adapting to. And then also racism towards Asians. I think this is a really important category of literature, particularly now with the Stop Asian Hate movement, with the increase in distrust of Asian Americans related to COVID and just to, ignorance. So I think that it's important to understand this category. I think all multicultural literature is important. However, I think now what we're living in right now can really teach us a lot of how Asian Americans are treated. So the book, Little Fires Everywhere, covers a lot of these themes. Definitely discusses race and identity, family, motherhood. I think that this story, or at least this book, may be a little more relatable than Alexi's, in that we all have probably had conversations and had relationships like those discussed in this book. So this might feel a little more familiar, but I think it's more difficult to analyze because it may be a little closer to the heart. So I'm interested to see how you guys take the first 8 chapters. We're going to read pages 1 through 106 this week. Sounds like a lot. It is a quick read though. So I will say there is a TV series, a mini series, I think it's 8 episodes, that was made based on Celeste Ng's book. I would encourage you to, watch the show if you'd like to compare. I'll probably throw some scenes up next week for us to look at, but I do encourage you not to use that as your only source. You do need to read the book because they are different, and if you just watch the show, you're going to be only getting the televised version, not the written one. So, alrighty, last but not least, you do have a project proposal due next week. So I wanted to encourage you guys to look over the assignment sheet and decide what you'd like your project to focus on. Choose a theme, a research question. This is all what we're going to do next week, but I just wanted to encourage you to look it over this week. I will, like I mentioned earlier, post some example projects just to kind of get your brain going. I know we did just finish Native American literature, and if that was a type of literature that was interesting to you, you can choose that as your focus, but I would encourage you to think about an area of multicultural literature that you personally are interested in. So lots of options. Thank you guys, and I will talk to you soon.